doubtless, that's obviously a great relief to you, Jonathan. I mean, in case anybody doesn't know Jonathan already, I mean, he's probably done more to develop consciousness of the crisis that we face on the left over the last 15 years or 2 decades in Britain than anybody else. And I think his work editing the what is it, 3 editions now of Million Climate Jobs has been really crucial in the development of consciousness within the Labour movement. And I think, quite honestly, I don't think we would have had the Labour for a Green New Deal without that. So Jonathan's going to talk, it appears, for 20 minutes or so on this, which is, there's quite a lot to get through in 20 minutes, I think. Jonathan, over to you.
Just for a moment there, I thought I was going to be allowed to talk for an hour, just this once, but apparently not. Okay. There's quite a lot of political and environmental experience in this room. So I'm going to talk briefly about the climate jobs argument and how it works now, things that most or all of you are already familiar with, in the first half of the talk. And in the second half of the talk, I'm going to concentrate on what's new in my book. I'm not going to talk about the political situation we're in now in Britain with the Green New Deal, although that's very important and moving rapidly. But I'm going to try and talk about what the book has to contribute that you could then apply to that discussion. And the first thing about the book is that it's written not for any particular country. It's written globally, and the arguments and Yep. Did I? Can you see me and hear me?
Yeah.
Something happened to my thing. Okay. The basic argument is this. We have had a great deal of talk about climate change, and we have had a great deal over the last 20 years, an enormous amount of promises about climate change, and world leaders saying that they're going to do something, and the UN saying that they're going to do something. And the result has been that the more people talk about that they're going to do something, the higher the carbon dioxide levels in the air become, and the more quickly they become higher. So on a fundamental and deep level, we're being lied to. And Greta Thunberg is right about this. We're being lied to by all the world leaders. And this means that we have to turn to a mass movement. We have to turn to a global mass movement, which we have to build country by country. And what we have to build for is government action in every country in the world. The governments are the only players with sufficient resources to do to sponsor and pay for and organize the enormous amount of work that has to be done. So to put it in Marxist terms that many of you will know, we have to do this through the state. Now, what we have to do also, because we have gone so far, is that we have to cut carbon dioxide emissions by about 90%. And emissions from cutting down forests by nearly 100%. And we have to plant many more trees, and we have to cut agricultural emissions by about half. But the central thing we have to do is cut carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels. That's central because that's the largest, by far, the largest source of emissions. In order to cut 90%, we cannot do it by limited schemes, and we cannot do it by degrowth. We cannot do it by reducing consumption. We're talking about we can consume more efficiently here and there, but if we're talking about 90% reductions in burning fossil fuels, people in Britain are not going to accept a 90% fall in their standard of living. And nobody is seriously proposing that, and much less people in the global south are not going to accept an 80 to 90% cut in their standard of living. That's simply not going to happen. So what we have to do is use energy in an alternative way. That's the fundamental change. And to use energy in a alternative way requires an enormous amount of work. It's fully, and I'll just, because we have to build a renewable energy system and change how we use energy, and that's jobs. And what we're campaigning for in all the climate jobs campaigns, which are now 6 or 7, 8 different countries now, what we're campaigning for is that jobs are government jobs, that they're permanent jobs. People may change exactly what they're doing, but the job is permanent. That that this goes along with a great deal of regulation, and crucially, the people who lose their jobs in the old high carbon industries will be promised and will be delivered a new permanent job, a climate job. That's what we have to do. The specifics of where we have to do it, what we have to do. There are thousands and thousands of jobs that have to be done, thousands. But the central ones that have to be done are, first of all, to cover the world with wind turbines and solar power. Secondly, to develop all kinds of contributory sets of smaller amounts of other renewable energies like marine power, tidal power, geothermal, and so on, which are important to balance the wind and solar power, because balance is very, very important for doing this. We don't have to worry about balance if we got a 30% or a 50% renewable system, but for a almost 100% renewable system, we have to balance the different forms of renewable energy, because the sun only shines for half of the time. Sometimes the sun doesn't shine, and wind is sometimes very strong and sometimes very weak. The most important way of balancing that is very large, complex grids covering very large areas. And that means that you're balancing solar power across time zones, quite a ways across time zones, and you're balancing wind power in the thousands of kilometers, so that you get a steady supply, and without that, it crashes. So that's the first thing we need to do. And those smart, large-scale electric grids will be the most complex and beautiful of machines that human beings have ever built. The next thing we need to do is transport. We need to make almost all transport electric. Vehicles electric, trains electric, get people out of planes wherever we possibly can into trains that are run on electricity. But also trucks that are electric, vans that are electric vehicles of all kinds. This goes along with public transport, which reduces the amount of energy we have to use. But the switch to electric is fundamental. And then with buildings, we have to insulate and convert every house and every building so that it uses much less energy, and so that it uses only electrical energy from renewable sources. All the transport energy has to be electrical energy from renewable sources as well. But also very important, we need regulations, building codes for new building that makes sure that it's that the new buildings use very little energy and all of it is electric. And in industry, we need to change all of the heating of materials so that it's done by electricity from renewable sources. And we need to stop making cement for technical reasons I can come back to if you want. That's the basic things we need to do. And in different countries, it means that we have to multiply the amount of electricity we have by between 3 and 5 or 6 times. So enormous grids. And we have to make all of that from renewables. Okay. A lot of the book is devoted to arguments about how we're going to do that. Technically, how are we going to do that? And the technical arguments are important. I think one of the things that the book has to contribute to a wider discussion in socialist circles and in Marxist circles about climate change is that almost all of the books that are written by socialists or by Marxists on climate change concentrate on the politics of it, or concentrate on arguments about Marx, or concentrate on some bit of it. But by and large, socialists, until very recently, have not contributed very much about how we do it. And the arguments about how we do it are important because on the face of it, they're technical arguments. But once you get into the detail, what I realized going through the technical arguments for so many different things was that behind the technical argument is a political argument in each case about whether or not what we need to do is cut carbon dioxide by 100%, not quite, 98, 97%, whether we need to do it now. And all of these arguments are people who come up with a reason why we need to do something else instead of doing that, or why trying to do that, trying to cut carbon dioxide on that scale will be impossible. And okay, that's in a sense, that's a development of arguments I've been making before. But I want to go on to highlight something that's new in the book that I really had to think through as I was working on it. It was very, very helpful there that it was being edited both by the ecologist in Britain and by the Climate Jobs Campaign in South Africa, because we have to think in quite a new way about climate change in the global south. And the reason, it's a simple numbers reason. In 2019, 62% of carbon dioxide emissions came from the global south. That percentage is increasing all the time. Soon it will be 2/3 of emissions that come from the global south. Two countries are in different ways typical of this, both countries that have industrialized massively. One is China, which is responsible for half of the emissions on the global south. And China has 1/3 of the industrial workers anywhere in the world now. The enormous expansion of the Chinese economy has led to these emissions. China's one example, but India is another, and in a different way, because China, the emissions in China per person are bigger than they are for Britain. They're half what they are for the United States, but they're bigger than what they are for Britain per person. And if Chinese emissions don't come down, we can't stop climate change. But also, if they don't come down, the government and the people of India will say, if China is not doing it, we don't have to do it either. Then their emissions will come up, as will the emissions of most countries in Africa and the emissions of many countries in Latin America. So what we have to do is find a way, a political way, and a political way of reducing the emissions from the global south. But here's the problem. Any way of doing that you can think of is massively unfair, because even China is much poorer than Germany or Britain. The average income in China is much poorer. India is much poorer again than the income in than the income in China. And the people in Malawi and Afghanistan, they're poorer again. And so it is deeply unfair that the poor should pay for this problem when they did not create it. When it was created, it was not so much created in colonial times. It's been created, most of it, since colonial times. Half of the total emissions that are up in the air now come from after 1987. But it's created in a global system of deep inequality, and a global system that is policed by an international financial system, the IMF, the World Bank, the United States government, the Federal Reserve Bank, and so on, that keeps people poor. So to say people in the global south must reduce their emissions or hold them down to the very low levels they are in Kenya or Malawi, that's deeply unfair and wrong. And yet it has to be done. There's only one, which is a terrible contradiction. There's only one way out of that contradiction. And that's to say that what people in the global south need to fight for is an alternative way out of poverty. They need to fight for a massive expansion in energy for transport, a massive expansion in housing, an expansion in industry, an expansion in heating houses and so on, or keeping them cool. These are things that we need to fight for all over the world. And if what we have to say is that we need a renewable economy through climate jobs that makes poverty history all over the world. That's the only way I can imagine building what we need to, building a global movement. And the importance of this is that we're not going to have the global movement we need unless we build massive support among workers and small farmers in India and in China and in South Africa and in Bolivia. We're not going to have it. And those people are not going to join a movement to keep them poor or to reduce their standard of living. They simply are not. It's unimaginable that working class people in China will be in favor of what would have to be, if we just do it through degrowth, would have to be a 90% cut in their standard of living. It's unimaginable that we could build that movement. And so I go through in great detail in the book a whole series of arguments about solidarity. How we build solidarity between the richer countries and the poorer countries and the middle income countries. How we build solidarity from below. How we build solidarity between workers who are building electric engines for cars and communities in the global south, in Bolivia or Chile, who are facing massive lithium mines and so on. But again and again and again, it's a matter of solidarity. And the fundamental form of solidarity that's necessary, the most important one, is that at the moment after COVID, it's very clear that governments in the global north can do massive public spending when it's necessary. What has been spent on COVID in the United States and in the UK is far, far more than we need to get all the climate jobs we need in that country. The money is there. But again and again, you see in the global south that when governments move towards an expansionary economic policy, they are punished by the IMF, they are punished by the World Bank, and they are punished by the big global banks. And so the most important form of solidarity from the North to the South is for us to build up enough political, economic, organizational, trade union strength that when they try to do that, that when the big banks try to do that, we can challenge them where they're headquartered. But the solidarity works the other way too. This is a human problem. This is a problem facing all of humanity. This is a problem that will not be solved unless we are solving it all over the world. One country is going to break through first. One country is going to have a full climate jobs and really bring their emissions down and have lots more jobs than they had before, and everybody's going to see that, and people are going to generalize from that. So we don't. One of the reasons we try to build in as many places as possible is so that we have one breakthrough somewhere, and it will be a completely unexpected place. It could even be poor old degraded Britain. Do you know what I mean? It could be anywhere. But we need each movement trying to build and increase the others. I think where I'll end with this is to repeat Greta Thunberg's point, to make a point of the COP now. If you look at the promises that have been made by governments going into the COP, the promises are that emissions will continue to increase until 2035. And that then they will be reduced. They are promising us, and all their promises are lies. Their best promise is that emissions will be reduced by 2050 to the level that they are now. 2050 is much, much too late to begin the process. All of the governments are lying to each other, but our arguments are gathering strength all the time. Just to say about the appalling thing that Keir Starmer and the leadership of the Labour Party did with the discussion of the Green New Deal proposal. There are two things to say about that. One is it's an indication of just what a cul-de-sac we're in as a labor movement, as a social movement, as a political movement from below in Britain. It's a sign of a bad situation we're in. But the other thing it says is that the reason that Keir Starmer has to forbid that debate is we would win that debate. And the ordinary members of the Labour Party would vote for a Green New Deal. And that's what's haunting them. And we are steadily winning the argument. It's a matter of putting together the necessary power. And if we don't, I spend some time in the book, and maybe I'll come back to it. If we don't, we are in for a very, everybody knows this, we're in for a very terrible time. But our arguments are gathering force and gathering support. I'll stop there.
Sean, you're muted.
Yes, that was me. I don't know whether that was me or you, but anyway, it's good manners to be muted, except when you've got something to say, I suppose. Thanks a lot, Jonathan. That was actually, it was really good that it put some structure in it. Well, it's a few weeks since I actually read the book, and it's very difficult. Very often I find with books to actually say, oh, so that section leads to that section, that section. So thank you very much for reminding me. Now, questions, contributions, anybody who wants to start? It's always this ghastly hiatus, isn't there? Is that Alan?
Yeah, yeah, it's me. It's the second time I've heard Jonathan's introduction. So anybody heard me respond to it before? A bit of repetition. The thing that there's the reason that I'm promoting the book, and I think, and where it makes a very important immediate contribution, in my view, is on the electrification of road transport or transport as a whole, but road transport is mostly, and cars mostly, because cars are 80% of the emission from transport as a whole, leaving out aircraft, and because it's 10 billion tons of emissions from the internal combustion engine method of transport, 10 billion tons, and it's just completely unsustainable. The other reason is that we already have a completely rational and perfectly good alternative to the internal combustion engine, which is electric power. It's been there for a very long time. It's been held in innovation really because of the pressure from the oil companies who managed to keep it away. But it's really the low-hanging fruit of carbon emission because it can be done very easily and very, very quickly. It will produce vehicles that will last longer, a lot cheaper to run and a lot cheaper to maintain. But we should also say at the same time, we want a lot less, particularly of cars. I mean, we need the other vehicles, but particularly of cars, we need a lot less as well as we need them electrified. My second point is, and I mentioned this in the last time as well, I think degrowth is utterly essential and unavoidable. Well, unavoidable, really, because the global economy doubles every 25 years. You've only got to look at that, it doubles every 25 years. So in 25 years, it will have doubled again. Probably be completely unsustainable by then. It's unsustainable now, really, but you know, it doubles every 25 years. And we just can't be indifferent to the growth in the economy. And it's not the case, in my view, that degrowth or even the stabilization of growth means offering people lower standards of living. What it means is different forms of production, different priorities of production, different priorities of consumption, and in order to reduce demand at the same time. All the things that are being produced in mass in China and everywhere else that people don't actually want, but they're persuaded they want through advertisement, they need to be cut out. In other words, completely unnecessary production needs to be cut out at the same time. And the third thing I'd say is, we need a mass movement. How do we build it? And I think the key to it is taxing the polluters, putting major taxes on the polluters, and use that money to and force the amount of carbon being used out of the market, and to use the money saved to in a redistributive way, so you redistribute to the poor of the world. And I've argued this for a long time, but I think in that view, you have to, as I agree with what Jonathan has said, you can't just cut the standard of living anywhere, particularly you can't just cut it in the South. You've got to offer people a clear democratic incentive. So the trick is to cut carbon emissions from the supply side, but do it in such a way that it is democratic, in line with social justice, and it's redistributed. So that's my 3 points.
Okay, I think Steve, you've got your hand up.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, a couple of things. One was to what extent, alongside reducing carbon emissions, we should be looking for more of a circular sort of not economy, but around carbon. You know, we have a huge problem of deforestation around the world, ignoring all of the issues around deforestation in South America for farmers, you know, big agri grow soya beans so people can make soya milk, so they feel good about sort of going vegetarian. But a lot of the third world people, go into the local forest to collect firewood, which they use for heating and cooking. There have been some small scale projects around encouraging people to replant trees, so you effectively create a plantation that you harvest, and then the carbon is recaptured by the growing trees. So you're not removing old growth forests. Whether that actually is something that we should be encouraging NGOs to go for, and what are your views on that sort of greenwash approach that we get from politicians in this country about changing the heating system and cooking system from hydrocarbon gas going over to hydrogen? My personal feeling is that the amount of work to ensure the distribution system actually didn't leak the hydrogen through various joints, given that the molecules are so much smaller than butane and protein. You know what I mean? And is this just greenwash? And should we be challenging people on those sort of issues?
Okay, Terry.
Thanks, and thanks, Jonathan, for the introduction. A few points that I'd like to pick up on. The first thing is, I think you're absolutely right to talk about making demands on governments, and I think that's quite important in the run up to COP, because I think there is a bit of a sense in some bits of the left of the climate movement of it's impossible to screw any concessions out of governments. They fucked it up for so long, and I can understand the frustration that's going on there. But I think you're absolutely right to say that it's only governments that have the resources to act in the way that we need them to. But I'm interested to know kind of what responses you've had to that discussion more broadly. The second thing is on the question of growth. I mean, Alan said some of what I'd want to say, but it seems to me a mistake to talk about a relationship between growth and standards of living, and that we need a whole discussion about what we mean by standard of living. Of course, you're absolutely right to say that there are millions of people living in the global south in completely unacceptable conditions, but I'm not sure to what extent if you look at the situation in India, which you talked about briefly, ever since independence, the Indian state has talked about ending poverty, ending hunger in that country. And the reality is that the Green Revolution, that the industrialization and the massive road building projects that Modi has introduced, etc., actually has led to the growth of a much bigger middle class, as well as the strengthening of the ruling class, but it hasn't actually changed the standard of living for millions of rural peasants or to people living in urban slums. So I think it's complicated to just pose the question in terms of growth equals the eradication of poverty. I also think that when we talk about standard of living, I think the whole question of people being time poor, even in the global north, is something that affects people's standard of living in terms of the quality of life. And I think we do need to change discussions from only talking about economic standards, which isn't to say that there aren't some basics, but into a much more fundamental question of what we mean by a standard of living. Thanks.
Okay, Jonathan, do you want to respond to any of those points now, or do you want to leave it till you sum up at the end? Since
Which do you think would be better?
God, don't put it on me. Yeah, perhaps it wouldn't be a bad idea to pick up on some of those points now, and it would mean that you don't have to do such a lengthy summary at the end.
Okay. I'm really sorry that I missed most of what Alan was saying as I was desperately trying to reconnect myself. I said at the beginning when some of you were here that I'm in a very rural, wooded area of the hills of Vermont in the United States, being a grandfather, and it's just a very bad connection. That's why my screen is off. Let me pick up the points that are made by Steve and Terry, both of which are really important. The first one is Steve's point about forestry. Absolutely, we have to do something about forestry. I think we have to do two things, and I argue this in the book. One is to stop cutting down forests, just to stop cutting them down. The second one is the estimates by the scientists are that we can replant about half of the forests that people have cut down since about 1900, which is when we began seriously cutting them down. The rest we need for the land that will grow forests, we need for agriculture or some for grazing. But what doesn't work, and I go into some detail, what doesn't work is sustainable forestry. The idea that what the trees that you're cutting down, you will then replant another forest, and then you will harvest it in 20 or 30 years' time, because that's a way of the carbon constantly being restored. It doesn't work for technical reasons I go into, of which the most important is that the most of the carbon is only really stored in the climax forest. So the last of the 30 years of the forest, it's stored, but if you do the math, over most of the time, it's not stored. Over most of the time, it's in the air. And the argument for sustainable forestry is that if you have sustainable forestry, then you can have, if you have sustainable forestry, then there's an economic case for the forests. And I think we have to make a non-economic case for the forest. I think we have to make a climate case for the forests, and we have to support the people who live in the forest to take care of the forest. And that means that the guardians of the forest need an income on a scale which is commensurate what everybody else in the society has. They need to be properly paid. They need to have schools. They need to have medicine. They need to have all of those kinds of things. And they need to be in charge of the forest instead of an NGO being in charge of the forest. The gas distribution, there are two different things here. One is, does hydrogen work? And the answer to that, I think, is it's not proved one way or the other. There are quite strong technical arguments that it doesn't work, and it's the ones that it will work as a miracle fuel. And I think what we'll find is that in some uses, of which I think vehicles are the most likely one, it may work. And in many others, it will not work. That's one argument. But it's important not to get lost in that argument, because you're right about the greenwashing. What's actually happening is that they're saying we will use hydrogen and that will be a new renewable fuel. But the actual hydrogen that they are now pumping and that they are planning to pump into our homes as a gas is hydrogen that is made using fossil fuels, burning methane in order to do the electrolysis that's necessary to create the hydrogen. So in other words, what we're getting is hydrogen that has even more fossil fuels based in it. And that's the fundamental reason, not a technical argument about hydrogen, for rejecting it. What they're saying is, of course, way down the line, we will do it with green hydrogen when green hydrogen gets cheap enough to do it. Okay, Terry's point. Yeah, I think it is complicated. I think there is a real rise in standard of living in India, or for that matter, China, and in most of the rest of the world, in that life expectancy has doubled in independent India, more than doubled actually. Life expectancy has doubled in China since its independence from imperialism. This is not true everywhere in the world, but it's true in most of the global south. No, that's starkly it's mainly India and China and the other countries in South Asia. So that's a real increase. And in India, there's not just an increase in this. I spent a large part of my childhood in India. And when I went back in 2000, it was very clear that the people in the middle, the industrial workers, the small landowning peasants, had a great deal more than they had when I was a child. And they were taller. And this is, and you could see this, the people, the sort of bottom quarter of the society, the landless agricultural laborers, were being kept down and had not, although the life expectancy improved some, their conditions were still terrible. And what you get in both India and China is an increase in inequality, a massive increase in inequality. And I think that increase in inequality, it's what we have in Britain or the United States or Germany too, or South Africa, and it's incredibly relevant here because I think there's, in an awful lot of the green and environmental literature, there's a use that people talk about we, and we have too much. And in there, we is not a landless agricultural laborer in India. That's not part of the we they mean when they say we, which is in some senses our fundamental problem. That our we is to only people of certain class positions and only people in certain countries are included in the we of the environmental movement most of the time. And if what we have is an argument from the people in the richer countries, where the climate movement is stronger right now, that what has to happen is that everybody has to keep their consumption down, people will fit that with an argument that they have been seeing forever, that they have to stay poor, that they have to keep their consumption down, that basically nothing can be done, and so on. They will see it as part of a much larger imperialist project. And I think they'll be right to see it in that way. But the same thing happens in Britain. If you go to a working class union meeting or a working class community meeting, and you say, people are doing this all the time, say, unfortunately, due to climate change, we will have to tighten our belts. What everybody in those meetings has learned through 40 years of austerity is that when people say we're going to have to tighten our belts, what they mean is that we in the working class, the people in the room, are going to have to tighten our belts. That will happen. But those people who come and say it to us, they're not going to tighten their belts. And so I think you could see a different configuration in a world where poor people and working class people all over the world, but particularly in the global south, have been able to defend themselves, have the choice of what kind of growth they want, have the choice of how much growth they want, have control of the process that at the moment is happening to them, that they don't control, then we have the possibility of a completely different discussion about what human beings need and what they don't need. But I would say that the argument for degrowth is it's an argument that goes around, that stops the argument about what do we need to do, what do we need to build, what work needs to be done in this situation. And the reduction of consumption will be only not a tiny part of that, but a third of that at best, a quarter of that, a third of that at best. It's the work that needs to be done that is central. That's a long, wordy answer, but it hardly scratches the surface.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Has anybody else wants to make? Roland?
I had my hand up for ages, John. I had it up before you called Jonathan to speak. You obviously didn't see my hand.
That's because you're using the old-fashioned physical thing.
No, I've had my electronic hand up all the time.
I'm sorry about that, Roland.
Okay, a few things. One, just something that Jonathan just said. We don't only have to make a climate case for forests, we've also got to make a forest case for forests and a quality of life case for forests. I don't think they need any justification, just that they're good for the climate. I mean, forests are good for people in any case. Briefly on quality of life and growth. I mean, Terry was saying we have to reconsider what we mean by quality of life. I think we also have to reconsider and redefine what is growth, because the problem is that we live in societies and economies that are based on the concept of gross domestic product and the need for this to grow every year. There are questions of what that includes, what that involves, but basically growth as currently understood means ever increasing production, not ever increasing benefit, not ever increasing wealth in terms of wealth of life. I mean, I think we need to redefine and reconsider wealth as well. I mean, basically, there's a very reductive economic definition of gross domestic product that is supposed to increase all the time that we need to challenge. But the main thing I want to look at is Jonathan said if Starmer had allowed the debate on the Green New Deal to go ahead at the Labour Party conference, we would have won it. I'm not convinced, and I think we need to look at this a bit more closely, because I think, and I'm not convinced that what we would have won was what we would want, or what we would have proposed. I think increasingly people are paying, people in positions of authority are paying lip service to, and it's something that you addressed in your talk, they're paying lip service to the need to control emissions, the need to address carbon, the need to address climate change, but they're diverting the demands for what has to be done to meaningless things or things that can never be done. And I think it's interesting to look at what happened at the TUC a couple of weeks ago, that basically, although it said that they support action to halt climate change, in fact, they took a step back. They took a step back. Precisely, you addressed hydrogen just now, but basically, the TUC is now calling for transition to a hydrogen-based rather than diesel-based economy. And it's a step back from where they were before. We're going to see this. I think we would see this if, and the Labour Party conference will still is still supposed to be debating some motions on climate change, just not the Green New Deal one. And I think we'll see this coming up again, people putting forward hydrogen and dirty hydrogen as the answer to all the problems, in the same way as they've been pushing for years that, well, sometime we will have nuclear fusion, so we can now build nuclear fission plants, because sometime we'll be able to, we'll have the technology to create safer nuclear fusion plants. Sometimes they're saying we'll be able to produce clean hydrogen, so let's develop now dirty hydrogen. But also there's the real problem of, and this comes up again and again and again in the Labour Party and in the trade unions, of unions refusing to address the questions of aviation, of transport, of refusing to see the case for green jobs, refusing to see the case for transition. And so, although it's true that the more we talk to people, the more we can get through the urgency of climate change and the need to do something about it, I'm not convinced even that I mean, in my Labour Party branch last week, we actually passed another motion supporting student climate strikes. I'm not sure that people even knew what they were voting for. They just wanted to say something that made them feel good. And I suspect that we would see the same at Labour Party conference. The motion might or might not go through. I suspect it would be watered down or hydrogen down. But at the same time, until we actually make unions understand that, for instance, aviation has to be addressed, then all the good sounding motions at Labour Party conference will be meaningless. So, I mean, it's not enough. Yes, it's atrocious that the motion has been ruled out of order, but I'm not absolutely convinced that we would win it, and certainly not in the form that we would support. It would be composited with other motions, and we would lose the real impact of the motion in any case. I think if it had, we'd have a chance to make the arguments, but I think we'd lose the essence of what we're arguing for anyway.
And Nadia?
Hi, yeah, I'm just a small point really. I want to pick on a couple of things that people said. One was Steve talking about deforestation and soya production, and also the whole discussion about what is a good standard of living, what are things that, what do we need, what do people need, and what we don't, which is, I think, a very contentious issue anyway. But I think my understanding is that the majority of soya is actually not for soya milk, Steve, but for animal food. And I think that the meat debate, you know, is a part of this. The majority of soya that's grown in South America, I understand, is to feed animals that people ultimately eat in Europe. And my own personal position is that that is something that we do not need. So I just wanted to raise that as another aspect of the argument.
Okay, thanks, Nadia. Could I just at the end make a couple of points, Jonathan? It seems to me that a number of these things, well, you know, everything interacts with everything else, doesn't it? So, but this hydrogen debate seems to me to be a very interesting example of what not just those on the right are doing, and that is trying to maintain some sort of adapted, perhaps heavily adapted form of business as usual. So that's, and it's all about looking as the capitalist system does in terms of looking at individuals as free floating agents. And so somehow the thing is that hydrogen allows us not to sort of question all sorts of other aspects of our lives, just why the obsession of people with electric cars. Electric cars are very, very much better than internal combustion, obviously. The real problem is cars. The real problem is actually trying to produce a public good, which is accessible travel with an individualized and commodified solution. And it seems to me that, I mean, when I was reading reading your book and realizing that basically you were blowing the old idea of convergence and contraction that I sort of went on and on about for years and years. You're blowing that out of the water quite rightly. It seemed to me that what you were saying is actually that we have to get back to saying, well, what is it, and only society, in fact only worker state is capable of delivering what we collectively need and aspire to. And that's, so it's actually talking about, we are forced to confront the issue of public versus private luxury and I suggest, that we need to realize that what we're looking at is probably something more like public luxury and private frugality, and in fact making the description of Commonwealth an actual real rather than abstract description of the way out of this crisis. Because actually the thing that draws together the people of the rich north, ordinary people of the rich north, and those of the south, is because actually their needs and their aspirations are fundamentally the same: health, education, decent housing, accessible travel, leisure, and a secure old age. Now, the thing is that a society which is capable of producing all of those, and which says is not about commodifying any of those, is one which is capable of being truly sustainable. And it renders the sort of debate, the debate about growth versus degrowth, as more or less irrelevant, because actually we're talking about, well, what is it we all need, what is it we all want, and how do we do that best and most sustainably? Anyway, that's abusing my position as chair. So, sorry, Alan, you want a quick comeback, because we're running short on time, so better be a quick comeback.
Yeah, well, I was just going to come back, Roland, what Roland said about the issue of growth and degrowth. There seems a lot of, GDP is a measure of global economic activity, which has been operating for the last 200 years. And in the last 200 years, global growth, in economic growth, has been 3%, an average over 200 years. It's been an average of 3%. And an average of 3% is totally unsustainable, because it doubles every 25 years. It's not a matter of even discussing, really. It just doubles every 25 years. We're walking towards catastrophe in mid-century because of growth. Now, GDP is not a perfect measure because it doesn't take into account consequences, but as a measure of economic activity, it's a bit rough and ready, but it is a measure of economic activity, and what it tells. And as I say, we're facing in the next 25 years another doubling of the global economy as it stands at the present time. And I think we just can't avoid this issue of growth. However we try to avoid it, we'll end up back with it.
Okay, thanks, Alan. You got a second bite at the cherry, because you're the only person here who's even older than me. So now we'll, Jonathan, if you'd like to, if you've got want to respond to any of that, and then we'll let you get back to being a grandfather.
Okay. First, what Roland, I was being glib, and you pulled me up short about how the Labour conference would vote. And thank you very much for that. I won't be that glib again. What I would say, however, is that I think that the leadership of the Labour Party fears that they would lose that vote, or that if they won it, they would only win it with the support of the trade unions, and put themselves in a shameful position. And I think it's also very important to understand that this is they regard as a cutting edge, as the issue on which the left in the Labour Party is strongest. and has the most impact and the most support. It has moved from being a peripheral issue on which you greenwash something to something that could actually happen, and therefore you need to pull out all the stops to get rid of it. The larger question, which is underlying this, of what are the trade union leaders are in a worse position, the leaders of the Labour Party are in a worse position. Almost every bit of the movement in social movements in Britain we're in a bad place. we're in a seriously bad place. We've had a very bad COVID, because the person who has done most to argue for having lockdowns is and for having some kind of control of COVID is actually Boris Johnson, compared to the rest of the Conservative Party, compared to almost anybody in the Labour Party. We're in a very bad place. And Boris Johnson, the British record with COVID is worse than Trump's America. I mean, but if you look around the world, what you see is a movement back and forth between deep quiescence, where it seems nothing is happening, and then enormous explosions in Sudan, in Lebanon, in Chile, in Hong Kong, and many other places. The Black Lives Matter in the United States. What we're seeing, I think, is that we haven't had the push through on our side, and also with the unions. The unions are being bad on. The unions were bad on COVID. The unions are being bad, much worse than they were before on the Green New Deal. But our unions are being bad. Do you know what I mean? My union, UCU, talks left and calls one-day strikes that never win anything. Do you know what I mean? We're in a situation which can be demoralizing if we just stay within Britain. If we look at the larger picture of what's happening globally, I think in many ways the force is with us. Nadia, the question of meat is an enormously complex question, which I try to address in great detail in the book. About half of agricultural emissions come from farming, mostly from fertilizer or manure, and we can't farm without fertilizer or manure. And about half come from livestock. What I lay out is a way of changing the patterns of consumption of meat and stopping basically feeding crops to livestock, which is something, and I try to explain how we could do this. And this is something that we need to do that's in the long term will make very little difference, because methane and emissions are not rising very quickly from livestock. In the long term will make very little difference, but in the short term will buy us 5 years of time, and is therefore very important. On the technical thing of most crops are grown to feed livestock in the United States and Europe. Generally, this is not true. It's not true in other countries. And one tiny specific detail: the soya in the Amazon in particular, and in Latin America, is primarily for export to China for food. And is very, very important to China. I want to end with thinking about two things. One is GMP or GDP. These are measures of a real thing. They're measures of the expansion of the capitalist economy and the expansion of profits. And unless profits are continually expanding, if you are in the bit of the system, of the global system, where your profits are not continually expanding, you become quite rapidly, for a series of technical reasons, unable to compete, and your economy crashes and you are in terrible trouble. And therefore, all the bits in the competitive world economy are that's why they have to have the GDP. It has nothing to do with the standard of living per se, although it's often marketed in that way. It is to keep the profits rising. But also, if we are to have degrowth, we have to end capitalism. Because to try and have degrowth without ending capitalism globally is to have a God Almighty crash. And that's why I think, but also what I'm trying to say about the climate jobs is they do not lead to an increase in emissions. They do lead to an increase in growth. About this, Alan is completely right, but they don't lead to an increase in emissions. And we have to tackle those emissions right now. And by having an alternative system of energy. The last point is Sean's point, which I think is very important, about this can only be done by a workers' state. I would say it can only be done in time by a state that at least the people have control of. I do think that this is a problem that will be solved. There will come a point where 200 million people are dead or 500 million people are dead. And there will be and the economies are being devastated, and there will be enormous pressure from peasants, from the working class, and from capitalists to do something about this globally. We will reach that point, and it is entirely possible when we reach, and it may be the solution at that point will be socialist, and maybe it will be fascist, a kind of green fascism that will make people sacrifice enormously, that will have enormous racist wars to keep the migrants out and so on, but that will viciously reduce production very quickly in a situation that's going to be terrible for everybody. But I think there will be some solution. And in the long term, whatever solution we have, it will have to be climate jobs, because we cannot have a solution without doing those jobs. It's not that there is a different way of making the transition. And and one of the reasons I think for as socialists, which I think everybody here is, the reasons for arguing for socialist solutions, for climate jobs, for government jobs, for well-paid jobs, for jobs that are built by campaigns from below, is that when things get really bad, we are going to face a bitter, bloody, war-saturated argument, torture and repression saturated argument about how do we solve this problem in a situation that has become an order of magnitude worse. And in that situation, we need a movement big enough. If we don't win it before then, we need a movement big enough when we start to hit those points, that the people who argue for sharing, that the people who argue for kindness, the people who argue for helping each other across borders and within borders, that those people are a strong enough movement. And I think that's why I've spent the last 15 years of my life dedicated to that. And I think that's the task before us.
Okay, thanks very much, Jonathan, and thanks for the exposition, and thanks for the book. I think this is one of the most important books that I've read actually over the last 5-6 years, and I think it's going to be an invaluable tool for us in the movement. So it's you've been using your time well. So.
Thank you very much.